I'm Andy Nelson. I'm one of the re-recording mixers on Wicked, and I handled all the music, the dialogue, and the vocal tracks, along with John Marquis, who handled all the sound effects and sound design work. My role essentially is to make sure that I can try and tell the story the best way I possibly can for the director. The storytelling aspect is crucial, and the emotional impact of scenes is crucial. And my job, I feel, is to try and make sure that we find those, we hang on to them, and hopefully elevate them all. Now, I had seen Wicked on stage, and I remember at the time turning to my wife and saying, after 10 minutes, saying, this is like a piece of cinema. It's going to be phenomenal when this makes its way to film. Never imagining I would ever be involved. When you take a musical from the stage and try and make one movie of it, inevitably the songs are coming at you fairly quickly, but you don't get a lot of time between sometimes. This film, by being in two parts, allowed us to go much more into the depths of those characters. But it also, from a dynamics point of view, from a mix, wasn't sort of one big number after another big number, which can be fatiguing. It allowed those spaces and the natural dynamics of the story to come through. Obviously, putting together a soundtrack like this or a movie like this is a huge team behind the scenes. Every player came with their A game to start with. I'd worked with John Powell, for instance. I knew when he was announced to be doing the score that it would be special, as indeed it is. When I went to London, when the orchestra was going to be recorded for the orchestral portion of the songs, because there were two sets of orchestras, one for John Powell's score and one for the songs, which Stephen Schwartz was obviously very, very involved with. I was so blown away by the sound of this probably just a little over 80-piece orchestra, playing very familiar tunes, but in a completely new way, because the cast album, of course, was using the original pit orchestras, and the size of the orchestra is quite small, of course, in a theatre. Now you've got this sumptuous, huge orchestras just resonating through the building. And I kind of threw all my paperwork away that all the notes I'd made in my head of each song. I just thought, oh, no, forget that. This is a different experience now. This is now incredible cinema sound. And Greg Wells really, he would come onto the dub stage early on and listen to a little piece of all the orchestra and the drums and the basses and then he would go back into his mix room and come up with a slightly different balance, knowing what I was going to have to deal with all the sound effects that were going to come in from John. The power of her vocals, of course, which always had to be right out there. You know, lots been talked about with the live singing, but it's a very important part of this film because you connect to Elphaba and Glinda so brilliantly by the fact that they are mainly singing to us live. If you're dealing just with a pre-recorded vocal, which can be sung beautifully and perfectly, there's just something in the brain that there's just that very, very slight disconnect that still works, but it's like having a sheet of glass in front of you. You take the glass away and you put the live vocal in and suddenly you connect. That's why the end result is so dynamic with particularly Cynthia singing Gravity is just like, it's you get a tingle every time you hear that, because she was hanging a long way up on the stage, singing her heart out. It's pretty amazing. I mean, the whole film at this point is leading to Defying Gravity. You know the audience is waiting, they're there, and you know that the very first line, why do you fly off the handle? You know that people are going to react immediately, and indeed they do. But I think it was really interesting how John and Myron paced that out, because you could have just gone straight into it and it would have been over fairly quickly. As brilliantly as it was even better to just sort of say, well, let's introduce a little, let's hold back a little, let's allow these spaces. And again, this comes back to the idea of having the time available by not trying to sort of say, well, we're at the end of a very long picture now that's had every piece of music in the original musical, how do we finish this thing up? This allowed it to have a much more sort of organic approach. And the pieces of quiet where she goes over to select the cape, I mean, it's so beautiful. Gravity itself, was all about dynamics. It's all about the end of the movie and how do we get this incredibly intimate moment when Elphaba has the tear and she's putting the cape on. I mean, it's so wonderful between the two of them. You can hear a pin drop at that moment. It's so beautiful. But you're about to launch into something giant. So again, building those dynamics was the fun part. And we were all on the same page. And nobody was saying, well, what if we do this? Or what if we all wanted this sort of same end result. So I think it was everybody pulling in the right direction at the right time. One thing I do as a mixer on a musical, I mix the dialogue and the vocals at the same time. I don't treat them as a song. I treat them as one piece of storytelling. Whether they're talking or singing, it doesn't matter. They're conveying lyrics and story to us. So I actually balance that with the music on, but kind of low, so that I can really concentrate on how they're sounding, what sort of space they're sitting in, if I'm creating a little bit of a larger space or a tinier room, so that they're all uniform together all the time. And then I introduce the music into that. When you're mixing, it's a subjective medium. There's no right or wrong in mixing sound. It's what do you feel? What do I feel? What do you think of that? Do you like that? I don't like working in a bubble. I love to work with a collaborative team. So for me, Nancy Nugent-Title, who was the dialogue supervisor, and John Stuver, who did a lot of the dialogue work with her, every line of dialogue in that film, I would collaborate with them on every single time. It wasn't like, oh, well, I think this is how it should be. We worked together, and that's the beauty of that system. Exactly the same with music, with Jack Dolman and Catherine Wilson doing all the editorial work for music. Same thing, when I would slide over into the music faders and we would start a music pass, I would work 100% collaboratively with them as well. Robin Bainton was hired as the vocal editor / vocal mixer, preparing all these tracks to send to me. Incredible. He would come down and listen to something and I would play something and we would both say, well, what about, do we have to, when he turns there, do we have to use the pre-record because what's the live like? Oh, well, let's listen to the live. Oh, I think we can use that moment of live. This was like the construction kit. It was incredible. If you looked at his Pro Tools, it was insane. So for me, it's about funneling all these incredible creative forces through, sort of under my fingertips, essentially, which is so much fun. It's not a power thing. It's about wanting to just serve them the best that I can, and that's for me. That's the joy of working as a re-recording mixer. When I'm working with somebody on Pro Tools, which is all the time, obviously, whether it's dialogue or music, getting that material to me through the editorial process is incredibly important, because they're taking all their individual tracks, phase aligning things, going in and digging out a little bit of noise reduction here and there, sometimes a lot, depending, and then feeding me what they think is the presentation. The beauty of Pro Tools is nothing is committed. So I can just turn to the Pro Tools editor and say, let's have another look at that piece again. We worked on this for close on 3 months of mixing by the time we did all the different versions, IMAX and the near field and all the different mix versions we have to do, and all the preparation, the pre-dubbing. About 3 months total, which is a good amount of time, and we used it all. Working with John Chu was amazing. Loved him immediately. I love his passion. I love his sense of story. He's very collaborative, which I really, really appreciate. He himself actually was quite emotional at times, as were we all at different moments in the film, because as things came together, it just sort of all blossomed. There was a sense of everybody pulling together on the same team with this film in a kind of wonderful way that doesn't always happen. Everybody, you could tell everyone's eye was on the prize of making this something special. I remember when I was in the cinema, or even when I was 14 or 15, and the lights would go down, and if there was a piece of music with a beautiful visual, I was completely transported in that moment. And that's what drew me to sound, not any technical aspect of sound or geeking out with tape recorders and things. I mean, it was more about what the connection to the heart. I walked on set and I was like a child because this thing was so big and so gorgeous and so movie-like. There was no sort of special effects, green screen. This was it. This was inside this incredibly large shooting stage. All the main actors were there. And I stood and watched for a day and just was in candy in movie land. You know, it was the best thing ever.